When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see anybody in the game, and the most important character as such is the island itself. So one of the things that I did with the music was to write the island as if she or he were a character in its own right. And that's really important, I think, that you're going through this space and actually it's completely devoid of people, but the music in a way populates the island, and that the voice of the island speaks to you through the music.
Which is interesting, because I think that's really come on in terms of later games we've done, that sowed the seeds for the way in which we approach music in Rapture, where it was very specifically the voice of characters. A Machine for Pigs as well, where the music was about being Lily's voice in the game, Lily's representation in the game. So it's interesting how, looking back on Esther, a lot of those kind of ideas were tried out here that then came on to take other forms in stuff we've done since. All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're gonna address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. So Esther was the first of the what are now called walking simulators, and it was really interesting that for us it didn't feel that weird to have a game that was slower than normal, where actually there was lots of time to just walk around and think and look at things. And it was amazing at the time how this was seen as completely revolutionary. And it's really interesting. And it's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened, where you thought about what you were doing. For me, it was kind of interesting that you could play some of the best moments in Doom are the bits where nothing's happening and you're just doing it, or System Shock, or those games that I absolutely love. Those quiet moments were the really powerful ones. But Esther is definitely slower than a lot of games, and I think that's actually why it's lasted. I think if we did have moments where we went, should it be faster, should we put a sprint button in, but I'm so pleased that we kind of held our nerve and went, no, just as like in real life, I don't run everywhere because that would be weird. It's okay to have a game where you don't run everywhere, and actually it is a bit weird to run everywhere, but if you're going to do that, then you've got to support it in other ways. And I think the music was a really powerful way of supporting that change of pace.
What's really funny for me though, Dan, is that shamefully I'd never played a game before I worked on Dear Esther. So I didn't realise that all games weren't like this, which is now looking back really naive. But I didn't realise that games didn't have, always have, this slow pace, and I thought there were lots of meditative games out there, and that actually wasn't really the case at the time, and that's exploded since. But in terms of the music, supporting that pace that you'd set emotionally felt really important. So if you listen to the music, actually the BPM is at a very slow walking speed. And it just almost, there's a lot of things now that say it's called entrainment, that it slows your heartbeat, or it can speed up your heartbeat when you listen to music. And actually I think what the Esther music does really successfully is it makes you almost accept, and more than accept, that speed. You actually start to feel that's the pace of your journey, and that I really like that about the music actually.
It makes you just comfortable with that pace too. I think it just eases you into it. You feel relaxed.
The radio mast in Dear Esther was obviously there as a really important kind of design feature, as well as its place within the story. And that, I think, came from, it was really interesting, it being a Half-Life mod to begin with, and the Citadel in Half-Life 2, that it tells you how far you are through the game. You're always looking up to the skyline, am I closer to the Citadel, can I see it? And it lets you know how near you are to the end of the game. And it was really important because Esther's so open in a way, and because there isn't this, you're not using kind of shootouts or kind of gating it with combat encounters to kind of constantly keep you moving, that it was really, really important that you always had that focal point of going, I know exactly from the beginning of the game, virtually right from the start, you know where you're going, you know where the game's going to end up, and you know that sooner or later you're going to be either at the base of that thing or climbing that thing, and it's always there, that red light. And I think particularly with the colour palette of the game, the fact that you've got this very, very, very clear red light that's unlike any of the other colours in the game immediately tells you as a player, this is what the shape of this thing is going to be. This is where I'm going. This gives me a purpose, even if the sort of moment by moment is a bit more abstract.
Yeah, and navigationally as well, it helps you. It draws you in the right direction as you play the game. You can never get lost if you just follow that one landmark.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place of where that sort of traditional game design is still. There's loads of it in Esther. It's just not necessarily done in quite the same way.
So something you'll notice as you look around the environment is, from a distance you see the landscape. It's kind of a beautiful place in some ways, but something I wanted to bring to the game was that there's this second layer beneath the surface. Whereas if you look at things closely, you see that the actual island itself is very polluted. It's kind of very rotten. Everywhere you look, every rock, every grass surface, it has this layer of filth on it, and it's kind of been put in there just to kind of emphasize further that this island is a really unpleasant place to live. It's like if you scratch the surface, you see like just how corrupt this island is.
We cast and did all the voice direction for Esther ourselves for the mod, and it was basically Jess and I on a casting website just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing. And there was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time round. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors. And we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him. And it was amazing when Nigel came in. We had, I think, a day and a half to do the whole thing. And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take. And we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like his instinct for the character in the game was so strong that he just, without virtually any direction, just came in and just got it. And one of the hardest things with the voiceover that we did was when we went from the mod, which had 3 potential narrative units per queue, to 4 potential narrative units per queue, was not only finding new bits of writing that kind of complemented and played off what was there in the original mod, but for Nigel to come back in, nearly 5 years later, and to just re-find that voice in exactly the same way and deliver it in a way that fitted in and complemented it was a real testament to his ability as an actor, I think. That apart from we had spent quite a lot of time trying to make the sound actually sound the same in terms of mic placement and things like that, but in terms of the actual delivery of those new monologues, you wouldn't know that was both written and acted sort of 4.5 years after the original thing was done. So the one person who's not in the room sort of today but deserves a huge amount of credit for how the game kind of eventually was delivered, but also I think in terms of how the game has lasted, a huge amount of respect needs to go to Nigel Carrington for his work on it.
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like we have no real death in the game. And from a design point of view, Dan, I mean, I don't know what you
it was
thought.
really hard because you know, it was a game where we couldn't let the player die. We didn't want to have respawns, but we had to handle the fact that there would be both accidents where the player would fall off a cliff or something, but also the deliberate urges of the player. Yeah. You know, the first thing you're going to do is go, great, there's an ocean, how far out can I go? Or there's a cliff that's really high, can I jump off it? And how do you have death in a game where you can't have the player die? Because if the player starts breaking up the experience by dying and reloading, then you're in you start breaking the experience a lot. So
yeah, I mean, we didn't want to also have like artificial boundaries, you know, where it's like an invisible wall. Like if you take a look through the game, you'll never see a place where you think you can get to, but you can't. There's always some kind of actual natural boundary or man-made boundary. So yeah, that was the other thing. We didn't really want to create this invisible wall around this thing. So
it kind of the whole drove the way in which that sort of the very weird audio visual, probably one of the most dreamlike bits in the game, where if you do die and you get the kind of the heartbeat and the strange flashes of visuals. And I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had the hole there and we hadn't had a place where we go, right, players will jump in this hole, we have to start from that basis, they will throw themselves down this hole, it kind of gave us the impetus to really, really focus on it. And I think the stuff like the drowning deaths and the cliff deaths are strong because the hole was there, and I'm not sure if the hole hadn't been there, whether or not we'd have arrived at that way of handling it, which I'm really proud of. I think it's a really incredibly creative, interesting way of handling a player going out of bounds and of actually being able to reset the game when the player's basically done something you ideally wouldn't want them to do.
Yeah, and I kind of think it fits well with the theme of the game as well, because you don't really know what's just happened.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
It's not like you hear a death sound and then you kind of respawn. It's this kind of like very soft, very ambiguous change. You know?
There was a point in the original mod where if you died, it would do the whole Half-Life major fracture detected.
Yeah.
It always brought a really good tone to the game.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But the island is also a beautiful and magnificent place, and what I wanted to do at this point for the first time in the game is to create something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point they've played in a very sort of Scottish style actually, no vibrato, very plain playing. But this was a really beautiful cue to write actually, because that has that scale. You suddenly realise that the island is really big and you know, you have this beautiful vista, and the music then shifts so the player can actually just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
Yeah, I think that's it. Can I? Yeah, I was going to say, this is actually one of my favourite parts of the game. It's just where everything, all the elements kind of come together perfectly. You've got the music, which is just epic, as Jesse said. You've got the landscape, which is kind of like this big open space. You've got all the little bits and pieces that I put into the detail of the environment, like the movement. There's leaves blowing around, there's the clouds in the sky, there's the mist rising off of the grass, and then you've got Dan's voiceover coming in there. And I think it's just like all of these elements coming together and just in perfect synergy, and just kind of, it really brings chills up your spine.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally. It's about how you understand the story. And not to say that you don't care as much if you don't find it, but it just adds this other layer of just the ground falls away from it. The first time I saw it, and the meaning of the crash in Esther's death just means so much more when you go, it's not just about her, there was an unborn child here. And I think that's where the randomisation just hits its absolute peak, because it's one tiny detail that may or may not be there. But if it's there, it's going to fundamentally change the way you feel about the entire thing. And that's the strength that the randomisation elements in Esther kind of provide, that you go, your likely kind of feeling about the story and your understanding about the story can be changed so absolutely by the occurrence or not of one tiny little prop detail. And that's something which, those moments I think are what make it really, really special. So it's for me, it's almost like the most important prop in the game, because when it happens, it's so profound.
Yeah, and it's again, it's just something that makes each playthrough more personal, I think. This is what I love reading about, you know, people finding these things and going, holy shit, I've just found this one thing that's going to change it. That's changed my interpretation completely.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting, because when we made it, we kind of had to, you know, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game is absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like the best bit of Dead Space 2, because for what feels like hours, but it's probably only about 15 minutes, nothing happens and no necromorph comes at you, and it's absolutely terrifying because it's just this space and you're just left in it. So I think the kind of the bird here is really interesting because it can actually really, really make you jump. But I don't know if that was part of why people were saying that the game was really scary, but it was a real surprise when people started coming back and saying, this is a frightening game. And I don't know how much of that is to do with the ideas in the game are frightening when you think about them, and how much of it is to do with just the emptiness and the lack of kind of things in the game make it a really quite stressful or quite frightening place. But it was a real surprise, I think, that sort of reaction from a lot of players when we shipped it.
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like, tech-wise, we were never ever gonna kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively. I did a few tests at the beginning, and when I realized this wasn't possible, I kind of went back and I kind of did some research on different styles, and one of the ones that really struck me was this kind of impressionistic painterly style, where it's kind of like there's just enough shape and color there for you to form an image, but a lot of it is just your imagination. It's kind of like the believability of the environment is in your mind. So this is something that I really wanted to bring over into the game, and you'll see a lot of landscapes that kind of look very surreal, very kind of unreal, and that's mainly due to this impressionistic style.
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here. But when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, for me, there's a lot of FPS stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for me, that was like really kind of core to all of the inspirations for the game, was this is a space that is about feeling, not thinking.
Yeah, I think the movies in particular, I think I hadn't watched the movies. I'd read the book and I played the game, but when I watched the movie, it kind of all made sense to me, like why I like the game so much and why I like the story. It's just like every shot is like a painting. It's like every shot has its story to tell. There's very little dialogue in the actual movie itself. There's just these long, lingering shots, and each shot is amazingly beautiful and in its kind of desolation. And for me, that was like a huge influence, you know, like trying to bring some of that through into the environments. So that is definitely something I'm going to struggle not to talk about. But the game as well. I'd say the actual Stalker game has a big place in my heart. Like gaming-wise, it's one of the reasons I got into game art in the first place.
Yeah.
So that to me is a big part of it too. One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player. With the music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things. With this shipwreck on the beach, you can kind of, like, if you look at it from certain angles, you get this real, like it's like a cross sticking up. It's this kind of semi-religious imagery, but it really kind of, it's not obvious, it's not in your face, it's just kind of like something that makes you feel like something you know. And so like there's a lot of deliberate attempts in the game to recreate that feeling, and it's kind of hard to point out in many other places, but it's done in a way where every single rock, every single plant, every single cliff face has been deliberately placed and designed in a way to try and make you feel something in the game.
This is another of my favourite bits in the game, where you come along the edge of the sort of gully and you find hundreds of books, and it's one of the first times where most explicitly there's the suggestion that nothing you're seeing is real, because there's just no way that this can exist, and it's a really amazing, uncanny moment. But it works, I think, for me, because you just go, I don't understand it, but it's lodged somewhere in my head and I can't get rid of it and I can't unsee this. And I think for me, like in terms of my influences from books, I mean, there's the obvious sort of stuff like with Burroughs, Cut Up and things like that going on. But it comes to the kind of books that I really love, that like Roadside Picnic, or the other one by the Strugatskys as well, I absolutely love, is The Ugly Swans, that's just full of these images that you go, I don't understand, I literally have no idea what's going on here, but I can't shake it, it's just got its hooks in me. And I think more recently you've got books like Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation does this so well, where nothing is understandable, but you feel the logic, but you can't understand the logic, but you feel like the logic's there. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing that games are so good at doing, of creating these things. And I think where a lot of game writing for me becomes kind of the wheels fall off it, is that they have these amazing ideas and then suddenly there's this huge rush of going, right, we've developed this mythos and we've shown you all the tips of the iceberg which are really interesting, but now we're just going to show you the whole iceberg. And actually that's never that satisfactory as a player because it robs the mystery. And I think the best game writing is those kind of moments where you go, I feel like there's something just outside the edge of my vision or just on the edge of my hearing, but it's the confidence to go, that's it, that's all you get, and the rest of it is up to your imagination. And I think it does loop back to games like Stalker. I think Skyrim at its best does it so well, where you just have these moments where you think, I want to know, but it's going to be down to my imagination to draw those things. And the player's imagination is the most powerful thing you've got in your design kit. There is nothing you can put on screen, there is nothing you can do with audio, there's nothing you can do with dialogue that will ever be as powerful as the player's own imagination. So if you oversell the idea and oversell the image, what you're actually doing is you're kind of not only robbing the player of the opportunity to invest in the game, but you're also fundamentally opting for a weaker tool than what the player can bring to the experience themselves.
One of the really important images in the game is the radio mast, and the soundscapes that I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea. So it's the concept of the tortured sounds that they're so broken down, they're so manipulated, and it really is supposed to represent the inner state of the protagonist at this point. It's that fractured understanding. So it kind of works on two levels, actually. We have the narrator who's trying to understand the journey that he's on, and we also have the audience's journey and their struggle for comprehension to understand what's going on in the game. So this distortion, this breaking down, this fragmented, kind of tortured sound really ties into the idea of the radio mast and that idea of communication, actually, that the game is trying to communicate something to you, the narrator's trying to tell you something, but it's so difficult to understand what that is.